welcome back to the RugbyWorks Talks, a podcast where we interview really interesting people and get different perspectives on rugby, on sport, on what's happening in the world, where we are really keen to talk to interesting, diverse individuals who have something about them that's worth listening to. And I am delighted to welcome Ashton to this podcast, who has a great deal about him. Ashton Hewitt, welcome. Would you like to just introduce yourself, say a little bit?
Hello. Firstly, thank you for having me on, inviting me onto the podcast. My name is Ashton Hewitt. I'm a professional rugby player for Dragons in South Wales. Been a pro rugby player my whole professional life, really, if that's what you want to call it. And I've been doing it since I was about 17 professionally, played as a kid. More recently, I've been keen to talk about equality, diversity, inclusion within rugby and also outside of rugby, because I feel that, rugby is just a reflection of society, and I think it's important that we're all educated. So I do loads of work with young people. I'm an ambassador for something called Positive Futures that engage with young people who are, at risk of becoming involved in the criminal justice system and those sorts of things. So huge passion for a lot of social work and making sure that people have the best chance in life, really. So that's a bit of background on me away from rugby as well as in rugby.
Fantastic. And of course, I will be twisting your arm to be an ambassador for RugbyWorks, because I think our values are really aligned. And I'm sure they'll share you. They can't just have you all to themselves. But before I do my arm twisting, you said that you've been playing professionally since 17. What was it as a kid that attracted you to rugby? Why not football or something else?
Do you know what? I was football, first of all. When I was young in primary school, I was always football. And not so much rugby, if I'm being honest. I was forced a little bit by a school teacher to play a game of rugby for the school to make up the numbers, because where I grew up, football was the most popular sport. So it was football for a while, and then for a while after that, it was football and rugby, but I was better at rugby. So I took that sort of path, and then obviously fell in love with it. So I did start off with football. I'll hold my hands up to that, but we ended up with rugby.
So it was a teacher that forced you into a game, so that sort of pressure, and then actually it just came down to the fact you were better at rugby.
Yeah, I was better at rugby, and obviously once I got involved with it, rugby became more serious than football. I wasn't great at football, so there wasn't that academy process and stuff that I went through. So I didn't really experience football in that sense. So rugby, I was better at rugby, and as I got a little bit older, I obviously started to experience the more social side of rugby, which obviously enticed me a little bit more in terms of friendship groups and stuff. I was getting to that age, a young teenager, where that sort of took over, if that makes sense. So I had a decision to make, and rugby was the obvious one in the end.
And rugby's been the winner for it. You grew up, I believe, in Newport.
Yeah, Newport, inner city, working class area, very diverse, absolutely loved it. And I've been quite privileged, really, to have the upbringing that I had. And I think it gives me a lot of perspective on the things that I talk about today. So, like I said, inner city, working class, very diverse. But when I was about 15, 16, my mum wanted me to move schools for reasons we won't go into. But I moved to a school in a more affluent area, if you like, a school with a better reputation, higher educational attainment for pupils and whatnot. And as much as I was reluctant to move schools, it's probably the best thing that I've done, really, because when I did move schools but remained living where I lived, and having my experience of going to my first secondary school, it just opened my eyes and took me outside of a bubble that I was in, if that makes sense. And it really made me aware of the disparities between social classes and how different people are treated. and different people's experiences of the world. And that happened for me at quite a young age, but it was just so obvious. And it's something that I'm really thankful for. And it's probably one of the most important things in my life that happened, if I'm being honest with you, to the path that I took through education, through my values and morals and what I care about and how I understand the dynamics of society and all the complexities of it. Is something that was hugely important in where I've ended up today and the things that I find really, really important to discuss.
What would have been different if your mum hadn't put her foot down and said, that's it, you're moving?
I'm not too sure. I got to a stage where I wasn't as committed. I wasn't as focused, if that makes sense. I always, because I was still in my old school when rugby turned a bit serious, and I knew it was probably something that I wanted to do, but there was a lot of distractions. Now, don't get me wrong, there's distractions everywhere, but I just didn't have that drive, that awareness of what it could be, if that makes sense. My commitment wasn't all there. I just knew it was something that I was good at. The support networks around me. So I'm not sure what would have happened. I don't think I would have gone to university. Definitely wouldn't have gone to university and studied, which is something that I don't believe is essential to succeed in life. But I ended up studying things that I'm interested in, things that have helped me understand the things that I care about and certain institutions in society. So it's contributed to the things that I talk about today. So there are probably a few things. I think rugby would have still happened, but I don't think with the determination that I had after moving schools, if that makes sense. When I moved schools, I was around people with a lot more focus. It was a lot more easy. It was a lot easier to be driven towards rugby, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. So in terms of sort of some personal things about you, before I ask you a serious personal question, let's go with, what's your favourite sandwich? Everybody loves a sandwich. What is your favourite sandwich?
My favourite sandwich, that's a tricky one. I think it has to be I think chicken mayo and bacon is probably my go-to, but not from like a Tesco meal deal sort of chicken and bacon, you know, the independent shop, you know, that does a proper sandwich, thick bread, and so not your average Tesco meal deal, which I'm hearing has gone up to £3.40. But
I'm a thin bread person. I like thin bread, masses of filling.
No, not for me. Nice chunky sandwich that you struggle to get your mouth around with a bit of meat.
So just talk me through. You had quite a bad injury, and you've had to come back from an injury. What did it? I don't mean the pain. Obviously, you hurt yourself, but what was it like to get injured? What did that do to your psychology, who you are as a person, to be out injured?
Well, I've had a few injuries, to be fair, quite bad ones. I've had 3 shoulders.
You've only got 2 shoulders. Wait a minute, where's your third shoulder?
Three shoulder ups. 3 shoulder ups on the same shoulder, so that's taken a bit of a pasting. I had ACL, MCL, so knee reconstruction, which is the one I think you're referring to, and then more recently, I had an operation last week on my ankle. I did what's called syndesmosis, so the ligaments in my ankle that I needed to get fixed. But so a few serious injuries, and it's tough. It's really, really tough, to be honest. No matter what the injury is, if it's something that has you sidelined, it's really tough in a few different aspects. Really, you're not able to help your team achieve. You feel a little bit helpless and a little bit useless because you've still got to go in. Your days are pretty repetitive. You're almost separated from the main group because you're on your schedule where you have to do all your rehab and those sorts of things. So with my knee, for example, I was out for the best part of a year and a half. So that repetitive schedule got quite draining, and it was tough. It can be a real lonely place if not many other boys are injured as well. Obviously, you don't want to wish it on them, but it's nice to have a bit of company in the gym. And then outside of rugby as well, you're relying on other people, and you know, my mum, my girlfriend. You know, it's a big burden on them as well, because the number of times that they've had to help me out, deal with my moods, look after me, part-time nurses. It's pretty tough. And then obviously your personal achievements, because away from the team, whether you've got aspirations to play for the national team and those sorts of things. So my shoulder, for example, I think we were 2 days out from flying to Washington, where I was hoping to get my first cap. We had 4 minutes of contact at the end of the session, and in the first tackle, I dislocated my shoulder, and I went from being in camp in Cardiff, ready to fly, all buzzing to go, rearing for it, after missing opportunities to injury before already. You know, and within 2 hours, I was sat on my sofa in my house on my own. And that was just the end of it, really.
How do you come back from that? Because that level of disappointment, how do you bounce back from that? What do you do? What does Ashton do to actually make you still want to get up and carry on?
Ashton feels sorry for himself for a few days, if I'm being completely honest. Ashton gets upset and feels sorry for himself and angry for a few days. I'd be lying if I said that I just, you know, got my head down and got on with it straight away, but that's not the case, if I'm being completely honest. So that's the start of the process. But then once the operation's done and you're fixed and you have your plan, so you return to play date, and you know, you have your goals set week by week, month by month, and what it is that you need to achieve. It's just about achieving those goals and being happy that you've achieved those goals. Obviously, you have setbacks within that program and over that time period, but it is just about, you know, being happy that you're achieving those goals and that you're on the path to getting back to where you were, and also believing that you can get back to where you were and the player that you were, and that you can achieve the things that you did before or that you've just missed out on, in my case. So that's sort of it for me. I think you can't be positive 100% of the time. That's pretty unrealistic. It's going to be challenging. It's going to be tough, but I think you've just got to believe in yourself at the end of the day, and convince yourself and really believe that you can get back to the player that you were and achieve the things that you could achieve.
Brilliant. I want to slightly go back to something you said earlier now, where you were talking about your passion for inclusion and equality and diversity, and the sort of issues that you want to champion. And obviously, the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement has been incredibly significant, coming out of a real tragedy, but has been quite significant. What sort of impact do you feel that movement is having? Is it something you would associate yourself with? Do you feel it's gaining momentum and traction? What would you say about it?
For me, so obviously, following the murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement, I feel that created such a collective, it gained such momentum globally. And I feel that as a global collective, that's past its peak. I think it reached its peak, and that sort of dipped off a little bit. Obviously, everybody's seen the controversies around the Black Lives Matter movement compared to the organisation and those sorts of things. But I'll always stand by Black Lives Matter as a statement and as a movement, but not affiliate myself with the organisation that, you know, is based in America and everything that's going on with that. That's not something that I've stood for from the beginning. Black Lives Matter to me and to many other people is a movement that is creating a collective that puts equality and anti-racism and anti-blackness at the forefront of conversation for people, and makes sure that we're constantly driving change throughout society. So I'll always stand by Black Lives Matter, the movement. And a lot of the time I'm explaining to people how that's different from supporting Black Lives Matter, the organisation, who take donations and this and that. So that's where I stand on that, and I'm pretty strong on that, and that's where I've been stood on it from the first time that anybody heard Black Lives Matter as a slogan or in any other context, really.
Thank you for that. And so for you, what was it like growing up as a black man in Newport?
When I was in my area, so like I said, in a city area, very diverse. When I was with my friends, it was great. Black friends, white friends, Asian friends, and everybody just understood each other, really. So it was great. Still experience racism now and again. When I was younger, when I was a kid, but not too much. Stop and searches by the police, probably as young as 12 or so. You know, which became a little bit normal. Something that my mother used to go absolutely wild about, and hated, and she used to go mad at me for not getting the badge numbers of the police and all of that. But at the time, for me, it just became normal, so I didn't bother. I didn't complain about it. I just sort of got on with it.
And do you feel very much that you were targeted for stop and search because you were a black kid?
Yeah, definitely. And more so because it's happened right throughout my life. You know what I mean? It's not just as a kid. It wasn't just as a teenager and a first time a new driver. You know, the last time I got stopped by an unmarked police car was probably a year ago now, which isn't all that long. So I've been stopped and searched countless times for ridiculous reasons. Typical questions: do you have any drugs or offensive weapons in the car? Every excuse under the sun. So I definitely believe that racial profiling and racially motivated stop and search is definitely a reason that I've been stopped consistently throughout my life.
I mean, and the statistics and the evidence would support what you're saying, without doubt, that there is racial profiling and it still exists. But I think there's a sort of wider societal issue that, you know, people talk about white privilege, and that makes everybody furious because, you know, you've got very poor people. And I say it's not actually about financial privilege, it's about the privilege simply of being white. So the classic example I use is that genuinely did this, put a ladder up to a window and broke into a house. Nobody knows whether it's my house. It wasn't my street. It happened to be my friend's house. Nobody batted an eyelid. There's a middle-aged white woman, middle class, middle-aged, sounds slightly over middle-aged, climbing up a ladder, jimmying open a window. I would suggest that if you did the same thing, not only might you have been challenged, the police probably would have been called.
Probably. And even if you look at, I'm not sure those who listen are familiar with Stormzy, but it was big in the newspapers that when he moved into his first big house, when he came into his money, that the first day that he got there and moved in, he had the police phoned on him because there was a strange black man in the neighbourhood entering one of the houses, and it was very unusual for the other residents, and he had the police phoned on him for going into his own house. And I've had a similar thing myself, not with not anything to do with houses or properties, but when I spoke about earlier that I moved schools, well, when I first started driving and I was still living in Newport Centre, I used to come to the village because the school was in a village just outside of Newport, and I used to come and see my friends, first time drivers, you do, just go and pick your friends up. And I got stopped by police in the village, and obviously they got my plates, got my address, asked what I was doing there, all the normal stuff. And then they told me to go back to my own area. And my mate, who was from my new school, was just like, what the hell is going on? And those are the sort of experiences that I deal with. And, you know, you say the statistics show it, I've got a lived experience of it, you know, and we could reel off loads of them. It's extremely normal experiences for young black men to go through, really.
And what's it like being a young black man in rugby?
It was difficult at times, especially before I felt that I was a more senior player, with a little bit more credit and respect in the game, and feeling that I could speak up, challenge people, voice my opinion and stuff like that. So lots of stuff happened, and arguably the worst racism that I've faced, sort of direct racism that I faced, has been in rugby right from when I was a kid, up until a couple of years ago, really. I've experienced it right throughout my career, grassroots, semi-professional, professional. I've experienced direct racism with malice and bad intent. And then that sort of racial banter, that changing room banter that we've all heard about before. So I've experienced racism within rugby in a couple of different forms. And like I said, it's happened right throughout my career. And it's probably the first time I really noticed it, and racism started to get me really upset and down, and my mum had to speak to me about it and why it would happen. When I was a young kid and I started playing rugby, and I'd go to different areas that were outside of the inner city that were less diverse, and a lot of the time it would be the go-to from kids, parents on the sidelines, especially if we were winning. That would be the go-to to sort of get at me and other members of my rugby team. So yeah, it happened from a very young age within rugby, and it's sort of happened right throughout.
And what impact does that have on you and your ability to play? Is it something that fires you up and makes you so angry you'll prove, you know, you'll obliterate the opposition, or does it actually take you in on yourself? What sort of impact does it have, that over very obvious, absolutely malicious racism?
Well, when I was a kid, and you know, you're playing for fun, you're playing to be with your mates, I used to ask myself why on a Sunday afternoon I'd want to go up to, you know, a village somewhere in Wales and face that. And depending on where you went, you know, you'd have the coach or your mother telling you before, right, you know what it's like up here now, just brace yourself for it and prepare yourself for it. As a young kid, you shouldn't have to go through that, and that shouldn't be, you know, what rugby's about, what sport's about, but sadly it happens, and it happened to me like it has been many other kids. So, you know, I'm sure there were many conversations with my mother about why I'd want to go and do that, or if it was one weekend that we were going to play a certain team, do I have to do that this week? Do I want to go there this week? And it can really take away from what the game is about. It takes the enjoyment out of the game, especially at that age. But then as you get older, and you start experiencing those different forms of racism, so in terms of our racial banter and those sorts of things, when I entered semi-professional rugby, so during the academy, and you play for a semi-pro club to sort of get your senior experience, if you like, and even in the professional environment, for a long time I felt that I couldn't be myself. I felt like I couldn't wear a tracksuit because it happened that I'd be bombarded with this, you know, the stereotypes of trying to be a road man or a bad man or a gangster or this or that, and they start speaking to me in certain different slang, just taking the mick. And so I'd never be myself, dress how I wanted to dress. I wouldn't I often wouldn't speak how I'd usually speak with my other friends, because again, people would jump on it straight away, because it's just something that people aren't exposed to and haven't got experience of different cultures, and they'd think that I was trying to be a bad man. But sometimes a lot of my language is something that my Jamaican nan would be using, if that makes sense. And she's definitely not trying to be a gangster or whatever it is. So
you probably don't want to cross her. Never cross your nan.
Never cross my nan. No, because it would be an earful. But yeah,
I'm interested in what gave you the courage, because I see this in a completely different context, having sat on boards, commercial boards or public sector boards, where you've got people of colour who've put their name forward, they've stood up, and actually it's so difficult to be true to yourself that you almost become the white civil servant, despite the fact that you're a Muslim man, or a Hindu lady, Hindu woman. And I wonder what gave you the courage to say, no, stuff this, I am going to be true to myself. I will wear what I want, I will speak in the way that I want, I will behave in a way that is true to me, and I will not change who I am just to prevent this banter. What gave you the courage to stand up and do that?
Well, for a long time, I didn't. And I'd sort of take myself away from the group, if I'm being honest. I saw it very much as colleagues for a long time rather than friends. I didn't want to go to socials, really. If it was after training, I'd be straight in the car and home. And I saw it very much as work, where, a rugby environment, now I'm happy to say that a lot of them are close friends, spend a lot of time with them, too much time sometimes, to be honest. But, and I'm not saying that was the case for absolutely every member of the team and those sorts of things, but it was sort of the overriding feeling and overriding factor of how I engaged and behaved amongst the team and in that setting. But I think the moment it changed really was when my understanding, because I had my experiences, but I didn't have the understanding and the ability to articulate points and arguments and feelings for a long time. And then it got to a point where I just had enough, really. Some of it came naturally with my seniority and my accomplishments with the team. I've been there a long time. I've been in the same club, right throughout my career. So that made it easier as well, because I was the one that's always been there. So I felt, people come and people go. And with that, I felt that I could just start being myself and sort of wouldn't be judged on that. So part of it happened naturally. Part of it was, right, I'm a senior player now. There's certain people in this squad that, can't take the mickey out of me for anything, never mind something like that. My understanding grew on the topic, the history of these stereotypes, the impacts that they have, and those sorts of things. My understanding of that made me able to, give reasoning if I pulled someone on it, right, that's not on, that's unacceptable because of X, Y, and Z. So that's one thing. And yeah, once you experience it for so long, I think I just got fed up, really.
Do you think the club has done more? Because we hear a lot about diversity and how it's important that we get people from a whole variety of backgrounds in our squad or in our workplace or whatever it is. But actually, if we don't create an inclusive environment that means you can be yourself without constantly self-modifying, there's no point in the diversity, because you still get the commonality of you. So do you think that the club has more responsibility here to do more to create a genuinely inclusive culture?
100%. And I've had plenty of conversations, especially after, like we spoke about earlier, with the Black Lives Matter movement and everything that motivated me to be even more outspoken, because for a long time I was happier to be myself, and I challenged people if I came across anything, but I wasn't proactive in addressing racism. I wasn't proactive in making sure that equality, diversity and inclusion were at the forefront of the conversation, if that makes sense. It's only after that really that I've really put an emphasis on how much time and energy I put into that. So obviously my club was one of the first points of call really, in terms of, right, we need to be setting examples here for rugby. I feel it's very far behind, doesn't pay enough attention to it like so many other organizations, within society. So I've had many conversations with the club. They supported me fully, with the abuse that I've received, on social media from fans. They've been hugely supportive of that. Everything that I've said publicly, they've been hugely supportive of. And then internally as well, in terms of hiring a new member of staff to make sure that we're engaging with underrepresented communities, somebody with that understanding to sort of drive that and push forward. An inclusion initiative that we came up with and put our heads together, and it's been backed right throughout the organisation, from the chairman to the director of rugby. They gave me the platform to educate the players, especially when there was the big conversation around taking a knee and what Black Lives Matter means, especially bringing alive that difference between the movement and the organisation and what it means to me, and what it means on a global scale, some of my experiences. And then giving me that platform sort of created so much dialogue between people within the organisation. I was getting phone calls. It just started conversations that people admittedly wouldn't have felt comfortable to have with me before I was proactive about it. And the club obviously emphasising the importance of it as well. So there's still lots to do, don't get me wrong. Not everything's perfect in terms of the club, that is. But it's something that they are focusing on, and they are listening to me, and they are working on it. So as long as we're constantly making progress and it doesn't become sort of a back burner sort of thing, then I've got nothing but praise for them, really, to be honest.
That's excellent. I think that's all we can ask of organisations, is that they become really open to the dialogue and really supportive of the initiatives. And it sounds like your club is doing that. Just before we move fully on to rugby, I just wanted to ask if you think that there is, if you like, a pigeonholing, a stereotyping within the construct of rugby. Are there certain positions, for example, a wing, that Black players are automatically put in under a set of assumptions that that's where you will be good? Or do you think that doesn't exist?
It's a difficult one, really. I'd probably take it away from positions in general. I look at it more through the lens of a leadership and decision-making role, if that makes sense. And I think that's society in general. And I'm a firm believer in history sort of dictating where we are today, and racism throughout history has very much contributed to that. And I think the lack of roles throughout society, and even in rugby, if we look at those sort of decision-making roles within clubs, I think stereotypically, historically, they wouldn't have got those roles. And I think that plays down to now, to be honest with you. So I think not so much now in terms of consciously, but historically it definitely would have played a part. And that sort of trickles down into where we are today, and results in, certain players in certain positions, maybe because they have role models in those positions, so that's the position that they aspire to be. And those sorts of things, really. It's a difficult question, and it's not absolute across everywhere, of course, but I definitely think that the history of that has a part to play. And obviously the reflection from society in general has a part to play in that as well.
So who were your role models, the people you looked up to growing up in rugby? Who are your rugby legends? Or who are your rugby legends?
Well, for me, it was Ali Brew, because the first time I started watching the Dragons was when he was tearing up at Rodney Parade for the Dragons. And immediately I saw myself in him as one of the reasons why that I was football before rugby, because of the representation in football. And, I could immediately see myself on a football pitch being represented before I could on a rugby pitch. Now, obviously, the popularity of the sport where I grew up was another factor as well. But, visible role models were a huge thing. And Ali Brew was the one for me. Do you know each other? I played with him. He came back to the Dragons because he went to France, and then he came back to the Dragons in my first couple of years of senior rugby, and was there for a few years further. So yeah, I know Brewy well now, and I've had the privilege of playing with him and learning a lot from him when I was younger as well. So yeah, that's pretty cool.
It is always, and he wasn't a disappointment. I mean, you are going to be broadcast and out there, but he wasn't a disappointment when you met him.
He wasn't a disappointment. Some of his banter's pretty poor, I'll be honest with you. But other than that, yeah, he was a quality player. He's a great bloke. So yeah, besides his banter, it was great to be able to play with him after admiring him for so many years.
And so he was your role model. Which coach, either that has coached you or that you see coaching in the game, has had the biggest influence on you? Who do you admire as a coach in rugby?
I think it would be when I was a kid. So before I was a professional, grassroots level. And I've actually had conversations with him more recently, actually, over the last couple of years, especially with everything that I've been doing around anti-racism. And I've had a lot of conversations with him about how it impacted him when I was a kid and how he'd deal with it. Because when I was that age, I didn't understand about, tribunals and all of those sorts of things that come around disciplinaries and grievances with things like that. So I took the opportunity to get an insight from him, and I think that's I admire him the most, because he did all he could to protect me. He got upset when I faced those challenges, and he definitely did all that he could to protect me from racism. And he's a white man, hasn't experienced racism himself. Didn't understand the complexities of it, the ins and outs of it, but he knew that it was wrong. I was one of his players, and he absolutely backed me all the way.
A true advocate for you.
Yeah, without truly, yeah, basically, and it was just an instinct from him. And I think it would have been a lot tougher if he wasn't my coach, or I didn't have a coach like him at that age that managed to protect me in such a way, and then also making sure that I still enjoyed my rugby and sort of became a better player at that age. So yeah, he's the coach I definitely admire the most in terms of making sure that I still had fun, even though I was experiencing those things, and knowing how upset angry it made him, and how much he tried to do to sort of shield me from it.
Right, fantastic. And you're still in touch?
Yeah, still in touch.
What things do you think would improve national rugby, not just Wales, but it could be any team? What are the things that we're getting wrong in the national game? What would improve the national game?
I was supposed to prepare this question as well, and my mind's just gone blank.
It's run differently, isn't it? So Welsh Rugby Union's different to the English Rugby Union. One has a model of direct employment, one has a model of sort of secondment, for a better word. Is there anything structural that would improve the national game?
I'm not too sure. I think for me, the we talk about the national game, but for me, it's a lot about the domestic game as well and how that feeds into that. I think the domestic game and the domestic leagues need a lot more support. I think clubs within the leagues need to be more aligned to make sure that so many issues that we see don't come about. I think we focus a lot on the nationalistic game. It wouldn't be that success. So we look at, Worcester and Wasps over the last few weeks. I just feel that clubs need a lot more support. We always see the horror stories about financials and funding and this sort of stuff, and the arguments that take place behind closed doors with all of that. I think that the governance side of it, rather than the structural side of it, needs to be addressed more urgently, if that makes sense, to make sure that every club is in a position to thrive, which then improves the national standard of these teams. You mentioned Wales and England. I think they'll only do better if the domestic leagues are looked after and have the best chance to succeed.
Yeah, and I mean, what's happened with Wasps and Worcester potentially are not isolated events, because I don't believe that they're the only clubs that have got that kind of challenges in their finances.
Well, of course not. We over the years we hear, whether it's in England or whether it's in Wales, the financial hardship that the clubs are facing, and we hear a lot about mismanagement and bad decision making at the top that's affecting so many people, that is affecting the game essentially, and that goes right through to now it's going to affect the European competitions and so on and so forth, and this big ripple effect. So it's not isolated. They're not exceptional circumstances that just Wasps and just Worcester have faced. They've obviously, got to that point, but I imagine there's a lot of clubs that have been on the brink for a long time in an unsustainable sort of environment. And
a lot were not helped by COVID. And I'm not sure that we've seen an effective COVID recovery strategy for those leagues. So I think we're living with fingers crossed that we don't see too many more topple. But going on to something more positive, we are in the middle of the World Cup. Yeah. What are your thoughts? Do me a quick Ashton Hewitt commentary of where we're at and who's going to win.
Where we're at? Well, I think England would be favourites on paper, but if New Zealand turn up on the day, I think they've got that flair that could see them run a bit of riot against England and clinch it, if I'm being completely honest with you. Sorry to say that on this pod, but there's no bias there, I assure you. But I think that's where it stands. I think they're the two teams, and on the day, I think if New Zealand turn up, they can clinch it. They can definitely clinch it.
And certainly starting your game after being on the other end of that hacker is quite something, I imagine. I've never experienced it myself, but
I can't imagine what it's like. Everyone responds differently, I'm sure, throughout the team, but it's definitely going to have some sort of impact.
Oh, well, I was hoping you were going to come down in favour of us more strongly.
Sorry.
Just a couple more questions before I let you go, because I've taken a lot of your time. Thinking about this sort of security and what we were talking about before, about the security of clubs and the potential growth of rugby, and looking at it compared with football, which has really commercialised itself and become an absolutely phenomenal global industry. Do you see, is there something rugby needs to do to follow that route? Or do you think, would you put caution out about saying, we don't want to drive rugby any more commercially than it is already driven? What are your thoughts about this, creating the global brand, creating the business behind the sport? in a way that football and golf have done so successfully, Formula One have done so successfully, but perhaps hockey and rugby haven't done it as successfully. Should you be aspiring for that in rugby?
I think so, yeah. I think commercialization is huge. I think that's, well, I know that's where the bulk of the money comes from in all of these leagues. And you have to make the sport more popular throughout all levels, participation rates, and get that interest. And I've always thought for a while now, especially in Wales, that rugby needs a little bit of modernisation. It needs to appeal to everybody. I feel like rugby is just a little bit behind in the sense that people who are rugby fans are sort of someone that has always been a rugby fan, or their family has been a rugby fan. And I think we don't appeal to people in the community that, you know, think, oh, you know what, that looks good, I might go and watch a game of rugby today. I think they need that whole rugby background to be a part of rugby, if that makes sense. And I'm not sure what the answer is, whether it's commercialization to get more money in, to build up the brand, or if it's modernization to appeal to these people and sort of get them through the door and get that interest. But I definitely feel that it needs to develop. And if you look at the URC, I think they're doing that a little bit, you know, with something as simple as the content that they put out. They've had some new commercial deals lately, which I don't know the ins and outs of, but I feel like that modernization, appealing to the next generation, is a huge influence, and then they come hand in hand then with that commercialization and that potential in that area. So I'm no expert, like I said, but I feel like there are definitely steps to take rugby to the next level. And I think that it needs to be taken to the next level because I think the game needs more money. It needs to be able to protect its employees, its players. And in terms of that safety for players as well, I think is crucial. I think an emphasis needs to be put on that. And money will help do that in terms of players outside of rugby and making sure you can help with their transition and all of the things that come with it. I think, unfortunately, money is a big thing in answering all of those things.
I think you're right. It's definitely money, but I'm really struck by your point about that connectivity with non-rugby families, let's call them. And it's certainly something that cricket have thought about in terms of how they can become more appealing, particularly to youth and youth culture. And they sort of introduced the 100, where they've tried to bring in music and cricket. Like cricket, probably won't go back to 100, to be honest. But I wonder if there's more that you think rugby should be doing to have that real connectivity with youth culture, because there is no doubt that football is an intrinsic part of youth culture in a way that perhaps rugby isn't. Is there something that we should be doing to bridge that gap? Could we make rugby more appealing to youth? Do we need to change the game, or do we need to change the structure? Is it about more focus on sevens? Was a new thing out with rugby 12s. What might make it so that young people become more connected with it as a part of their cultural aspiration?
I don't think there's too much difference between whether it's sevens, the introduction of the 12s that was discussed a couple of years ago now. I think it's about the experience, to be honest with you. And I think if you look at then obviously this is a million miles away, but if you look at the NBA, the NFL, it's a whole entertainment experience. And I think you could go there with it. Like, I haven't got a clue about basketball, but I still wanted to go to a basketball match when I went to New York. Do you know what I mean? And people go to the NFL if they don't know anything about NFL because so-and-so is going to be there performing, or it's just the whole experience of what it is. It's more than just a sport. And I think that's what sport is coming to, really. And I think that's definitely what you need to do if you want to get more people through the door who aren't the die-hard rugby fans. I think you need to create that entertainment aspect of it that's got, you know, a lot of different things going on. If it's a bad match, then so-and-so makes up for it. If a team's poor in form, the stadium's still bouncing, you've still got the experience. And I think it would just help all round, really. It's not just about, obviously performance is a huge part of it, whether people support you or not. But I think in terms of appealing to a new audience and getting people through the door, people who have no rugby background or history or little understanding, it's about that experience for me. And that's what I mean a little bit in terms of that modernisation, is maybe taking a leaf out of some of these other sports book and making it cool, making it something you want to be a part of. If you look at football players and how idolised they are, how known they are, I think rugby can do a lot more to sort of promote these players. And the more popular the players are in society, I think the more popular the sport will be, the more interest that they'll take, the more interest leagues and teams put emphasis on what their players care about, what they're doing away from rugby, and sort of creating that engagement with fans and potential fans would go a long way.
Yeah, it is. It's about that experience, isn't it? And that connectivity with your own personal lived experience that makes you want to go to something. Because you're right. When I went to the States, I went and, I had to go and see a game of basketball. I had to go and see a game of American football. I even had to go to the baseball. I won't go there because I knew I was going for an experience.
Yeah.
And I think that there's probably more edgy stuff happening around social media in football, and I think rugby's really quite traditional in its approach to its use of those mediums. There is no sort of alternative channel for rugby, and that might be one way to start bridging that gap. And maybe you could host it.
Maybe I could host it. I've not hosted anything before, but I'll keep my phone on, and if it ever comes about, then I'll give it a go.
Brilliant. And Ashton, it's been an absolute pleasure. Just to end on, what would be your one piece of advice we work with young people who've been excluded from school. They've come from very difficult backgrounds, and I think it's very hard when you're put outside mainstream. You know what it was like just to change schools, but to be put into these people referral units or exclusion units within the school, it's hard to feel like you've got a future. What would be your advice to them? Based on your experience, what would you be saying to them?
I think the one thing for me would be, don't be afraid to try new things and get out of your comfort zone. Now, it's easier said than done. And I've experienced that. It took me a long time to get out of my comfort zone and what I knew. But once you do it, it opens up opportunities that you might not have thought of. You experience or maybe do things that you didn't think you'd like, but you do like. And things might start coming together a little bit, with a bit of hard work. I don't think many people know exactly what it is that they want to do when they're a young person. But I think just get out of your comfort zone, have confidence in yourself, and don't be afraid to be yourself and be who you are. And just try and enjoy whatever you do. So, yeah, I appreciate, the circumstances that some people in, and it brings me down, if I'm being honest. But yeah, if there are any young people listening, just be yourself, embrace yourself, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise.
Brilliant. Ashton Hewitt, you have been an absolute superstar. It's been my pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for giving us the time.
Thank you for having me on.